The word of the Lord is from the book of Genesis, chapter 4. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a shepherd of the flock, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, is there not an uplifting? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. And his desire is for you, but you have dominion over him. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. And today's final reading from the Word comes from the book Arcana, a passage that is explaining part of the reading from the book of Exodus chapter 2 about Moses. And she took pity on him means an admonition from the divine. This is clear from the meaning of taking pity as an influx of charity from the Lord. For when anyone looks with charity on someone in distress, as Pharaoh's daughter does here on the child crying in the box made of rush, a feeling of compassion is aroused. And since the feeling is stirred by the Lord, it is an admonition from him. Indeed, when people who are perceptive have feelings of compassion, they know that they are being admonished by the Lord to offer help. Amen. Blush, the story of Moses and Pharaoh's daughter and the story of Cain and Abel seem entirely unlike one another. One story is about an act of compassion, and the other is the story of the first act of violence in the Word. These stories do have something in common, though. In different ways, they both address the idea that we have a certain duty or obligation to care for our neighbor. That idea shouldn't come as a shock to any of us. How many times have we all been reminded that the Lord commands us to love our neighbor? But often what we do with that teaching to love our neighbor is we direct it inwards. We shine the light of the Lord's teachings on our own process of learning to love, which is a good thing to do. But it's important to remember that in the meantime, we are responsible for what we do and what we don't do for our neighbor. The reading from Arcana Coelestia said that the pity that Pharaoh's daughter felt when she saw baby Moses crying in his ark of reeds was an admonition from the Lord. The reading said that all feelings of compassion are an admonition from the Lord, an admonition to offer help. And it said that people who have perception recognize that the feelings aren't just feelings. They're messages from God. They're calls to action, which is really easy to see if you think about finding an abandoned baby by a river. If you were in Pharaoh's daughter's shoes, it would be pretty clear that more than just sympathy was required of you. What's striking about that teaching is the use of the word admonition. An admonition from the Lord is not to be held lightly. The Latin word translated as admonition could also be translated as a warning. A warning about what? The implication when we're admonished to help somebody is that we'll be held responsible for a failure to do so. Which again is pretty clear if you think about something like finding an abandoned baby by a river. Choosing to walk away from that baby wouldn't be a neutral decision. It would be wrong. This idea that we're responsible for what we don't do, for the service that we fail to render to our neighbor, is big. And it can be a heavy weight to carry. But there's a certain undeniable truth to it. Apathy isn't a neutral thing. Turning a blind eye isn't a neutral thing. These things are wrong. The recitation today was about the Lord telling the righteous that any act of service that they had done for any of the Lord's people was an act of service that they had done for the Lord. The Lord is served when His people are served. But in the next part of that story, the Lord deals with the other side of the coin. He turns to the unrighteous and He says to them, He rebukes them, saying, I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. Then they also will answer Him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you? Then He will answer them, saying, Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it for one of the least of these, you did not do it for me. So these unrighteous people are rebuked not for what they did, but for what they failed to do. And that's a tough teaching. And it should be said right here and now that we mustn't push that idea too far. We can't make ourselves personally responsible for the suffering of every human being who is hungry or homeless or whatever it may be. The Lord's calling our attention to our willingness or unwillingness to serve. And He's not asking us to put ourselves in His place and make ourselves responsible for things that aren't ours to control. That's a pretty important idea, and we'll come back to it in a bit. As I said before, the story of Cain and Abel is very different from this story of Moses, but it ties right into this theme of being responsible for how we treat people. When the Lord asks Cain where his brother is, Cain answers, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The story invites us to imagine him saying that pretty angrily. He's blustering and he's trying to hide the fact that he knows exactly what happened to Abel. That question, am I my brother's keeper, means, am I responsible for my brother? Are we our brother's keepers? The Lord doesn't directly answer Cain's question, and that's significant. To give either a yes or a no answer would be truthful in some respects and untruthful in others. But But in the context of the story, was Cain responsible for what had happened to his brother? Emphatically, he was. And so the Lord said to him, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." We are responsible for what we do to other people. That's incredibly obvious, and yet people work all the time to make somebody else responsible for their own choices. And so kids will say, "Oh no, that wasn't me, that was my baby brother." And an adult will say, "You made me so angry," as though somebody else's behavior can take away our freedom of choice. Or will claim that we're just victims of circumstance and that forces larger than ourselves have driven us to act the way we've acted. But the truth is really simple. Every single human being is responsible for the choices they make, no more and no less. The story of Cain and Abel is about a murder, and the idea that a murderer is responsible for the murder they commit is so obvious that it hardly seems worth talking about. But in the internal sense, this story is about a more subtle kind of responsibility. Cain and Abel both represent things that exist within us. And so the thing that's killed in this story is something that we could choose to kill within ourselves. Cain represents faith, and Abel represents charity. And this is how charity is defined in the heavenly doctrines of the new church. Charity means love toward the neighbor and compassion. For anyone who loves his neighbor as himself also has as much compassion for him in his suffering as he does for himself in his own. So Abel represents goodwill towards people in general, and that goodwill encompasses the pang of compassion that Pharaoh's daughter felt when she heard Moses cry. Cain represents faith, and faith means belief in or acceptance of religious teachings. In and of itself, faith is a good thing, and if Cain had been content to take second place and serve his brother, this story would have had a happy ending. But this story is about faith that is unwilling to be ruled by charity. So Cain killed Abel, which represents a desire for superiority or righteousness or something like that, subjugating, stifling, and snuffing out the charity that the Lord stirs within us. In general, bloodshed in the word represents violence done to charity, which is the same thing as hatred. We're told, someone who hates not only has no charity, but also does violence to it. That is, he sheds blood. It is in hatred that murder lies, as is quite clear from the fact that the one desire of him who hates another is to see him killed. Hatred is bloodshed. Even if it lies almost completely hidden within us, hatred does violence to the charity that the Lord gives us. Hatred stifles our willingness and ability to serve, our willingness and ability to answer the call of compassion. In Arcana Coelestia, we're told that Cain's words, "Am I my brother's keeper?" mean that faith regarded charity as worthless and was unwilling to be its servant. And that's what this story is really about. An unwillingness to be the servant of charity. An unwillingness to answer the call of compassion. Are we responsible for that unwillingness? Are we our brother's keeper? In the internal sense, the word brother means charity. So are we responsible for our own charity and for any violence that we perpetrate against it? The answer is yes, we are. All of these ideas are probably somewhat self-evident. But the crying need for all of these ideas to be acknowledged and upheld in the world around us is also pretty evident. How often do human beings turn a blind eye on one another's suffering? How often do we choose what's comfortable over the love and compassion that the Lord asks of us? We are our brother's keepers, at least in the sense that we are responsible for doing our brothers and sisters no harm. And yet, how often does buried or almost hidden hatred smooth out a path for injury and injustice? Recently, there's been a surge of awareness of racism in Western culture, specifically in the United States. Racism is a form of violence done to charity. And racist attitudes cause harm, even if they remain almost hidden. Even if we don't act on them directly, those racist attitudes hurt our ability to serve with love and with compassion, and that has a ripple effect. Racism is just one form of violence done to charity. We have an obligation to rise above these things. We are our brother's keepers, inasmuch as we have been admonished by our God to love, to serve, and to have compassion. Like I said, these ideas can land pretty heavily, and if we hold them the wrong way, they become an unfair or an unhelpful burden. So there are a couple of qualifying ideas that need to be brought into the picture. The first qualifying idea is that charity is first and foremost a spiritual thing. And the service that the Lord truly wishes for us to render to our neighbor is service that has their eternal happiness in view. When the word charity is used outside of the new church, often what it means is giving money to charitable donations. And contributing money is a good thing, but it's not the core of charity. You can give away a lot of money and still be a nasty, destructive person, and no amount of money can buy happiness. Serving our neighbor with an eye towards their spiritual happiness means sharing what is truly good with them. It means supporting them in making the right decisions. It means strengthening their spirits by showing them compassion. It means sharing your religion or sharing the truths that have helped you find your way to the extent that those things will be usefully received. And of course, buying a meal, doing the dishes, or donating money are also ways in which we can serve our neighbor. The bottom line, though, is that serving our neighbor first and foremost means doing them no harm. It may not seem like it, but tackling the hatred in our own hearts does the world far more good than any amount of money ever could on its own. The other qualifying idea that needs to be brought into the picture I'm presenting is that we're not God. Once again, this is a really obvious idea that hardly even needs to be said, except that we forget it all the time. Most of us, in one way or another, take on too much. We put the weight of the world on our shoulders, or we put the weight of another person's happiness on our shoulders. And we can't carry those burdens. We cannot fix the world. We can't make even one person happy if that person doesn't want to be happy. We are responsible for our own choices and for our own choices alone. What separates heaven from hell isn't the lists of the good deeds that the angels have accomplished. It's the angels' willingness to serve. Every little act of charity or compassion holds a piece of heaven within it. And that's why the Lord in Matthew said, "Inasmuch as you did these things to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did these things for me." It is the Lord and His love that reduce charity to order and make it make sense. When we try to be a good citizen or a good person without the Lord, it feels overwhelming. But if we allow the Lord to be present with us little by little, it all becomes simpler and simpler. The Lord has commanded us to love, and if we obey Him, His love abides in us. His love and His truth dwell within us, and they move us, and they call to us. And our job is simply to answer the call. As the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in His love. Amen.